Hello everyone, Kenton Kivestu from the RocketBlocks team here. In this mock interview video, we're sitting down with Alan Yang, who is currently the head of product management at Bubble, a popular no-code development tool, and previously was a product manager at Google, where he focused on their productivity apps, including Docs, Sheets, and Slides. In this mock interview video, we're going to tackle a product design and product sense question where Alan is asked to design a new feature to help small and local businesses cope with the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's go ahead and jump in and see how Alan tackles this.
I want to do sort of a product case question. And imagine you are, a PM. You're going to have some free reign here to pick a particular product or big tech company that you want to work with in that sphere. But basically, we want you to think about and walk us through designing a feature that would help local businesses get through COVID. So you've got sort of free reign you could pick a big tech company and say, hey, I'm going to build a new feature on top of X. Or you could say, hey, this is just like a new company or a new idea, and we're going to build this to help local businesses. So however you would like to pursue.
Cool. And I'm just going to take notes over here on the screen. Could I ask a few follow-up questions to start?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. So I guess from the way the question is posed, it would probably help if I chose, let's perhaps assume that I'm building this feature in the context of like Google and Google Maps, if that's okay. So for this particular prompt, is there any kind of, maybe not like Google level, but like Google Maps level goal that you want me to keep in mind? Or should I kind of like specify, I guess?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I think I do think having sort of a particular goal about like how we'll know if we're successful, if this feature has made a difference, makes sense. But we are open to you sort of specifying, hey, like I'm really going to focus on, either driving a big revenue impact while helping small businesses, or say like, we just want to help the maximum number of small businesses regardless of revenue upside for Google Maps in this case.
Awesome. And should I start off with any assumptions about the personas that Google Maps already likes to work with, or should I propose personas relevant to the question?
Good question. I think in this case, you can propose personas that you want to work with.
Okay, cool. And is it all right if I make certain assumptions about like the kinds of data we have, or like the kinds of like sources of data that Google Maps might have?
Of course. I think, if you have some assumption that seems crazy, we might have some questions about it, but yeah, feel free to assume certain data types or stores of data that we might have access to.
Okay, awesome. Do you mind if I take a second to compose some thoughts?
No problem. Go ahead.
Thanks. Okay, cool. So if it's all right with you, here are some of the different topics I thought I could walk through, and please let me know if you want me to add anything, remove anything, etc. So I'll start out by just kind of like, again, sort of restating the goal to make sure we're on the same page there, and not just the goals for the feature, but possibly ties to broader goals. I'll talk about who some of the users involved seem to be, or who they might be. Then I'll sort of propose some ideas for a potential like V1 or even like MVP of this. Then after that, some perhaps like V2 ideas. Then I'll talk a little bit more about metrics again, how we might sort of go one level more detailed on metrics we can track and how they tie up to the goal. I'll talk a little bit about like maybe risks or like how we might need to engage other functions. And then I can close out by talking about like where could this all be heading, like what a future vision of this might look like.
Okay, that sounds like a pretty good plan to me.
Cool. So in terms of the goal, to start off, at its core, we want to design some kind of an experience to help local businesses in the time of COVID. I think in this particular case, maybe we can assume that the goal is something around engagement of Google Maps users with Google Maps. And I propose that in particular because I think it's kind of a like a win-win-win on all sides, actually. Where like if end users are engaging with it more, that means they are finding whatever we build useful in some way. If the end users are engaging with it more, that probably means there's some value to the local businesses, given the feature will be centered around
Okay.
them. And Google Maps, their revenue model, if you think that maybe most of the revenue is coming from ads, like there's of course benefit to having more users engaged on the product. So that's why I sort of choose user engagement as like kind of the overarching goal, so to speak.
Got it. Okay. So user engagement is the North Star.
Yep.
Cool.
Cool. So if we think about users, there are definitely the small business, the local businesses, I should say, involved. And I imagine this breaks down in a few different ways, which might become relevant um, as we sort of think about what it looks like.
Okay.
I think one way to slice it might be thinking about just like the different kinds of businesses in terms of industry, perhaps.
Okay.
This is potentially very relevant here because COVID has had a different effect on different kinds of companies. So like restaurants, have a very different impact, felt a very different impact versus I'm going to say like a local doctor's clinic or something,
Yep.
which might also be listed on Google. We may also want to think at some point about whether there's a difference in, I'll call it like tech savviness levels of different businesses. Um, that it's something I'm sure the product overall keeps in mind, but assuming that there are already like ways that Google Maps interacts with local businesses, like perhaps there's something we can kind of scaffold off of here. Um,
And why is tech savviness in this particular case? Why are you honing in on that as something that we would care about as we segment businesses?
Yeah, I think it probably has more impact when I imagine we're thinking about like the design of it, like the actual like experience, the UX of it. Because if you have a much less tech savvy business owner who maybe they're a solo entrepreneur and they just don't have a lot of time, like versus a very well run like fully staffed operation which might have somebody like dedicated to their digital presence. Like it's just a very different kind of user within the company approaching the product.
Okay.
I again not sure it has as much impact on like the overall thrust of what we're designing, but like when you work with the designer on the project to think about like what exactly does this look like what are the interfaces, what are the things you want to make easier versus tougher, that difference might be important.
Okay. Fair enough. Cool.
So to start off, yes. So we were segmenting businesses. Probably also useful to briefly mention the end users as well. I imagine Google Maps must have known personas for end users, but if I had to propose them, I would say there are probably one way you can distinguish end users is to talk about their motivations for coming to Google Maps. So, for example, you have some users who are probably coming to Google Maps who know exactly where they want to go. They like want to type it in and get directions, and like boom, like that's it, and follow the directions. There are also probably users who come to Google Maps who just kind of want to see what's around, or to like browse essentially a geographic area. There might be something kind of in the middle, but kind of distinct, where you have somebody coming and they have like a particular business in mind, like maybe a restaurant, and they're like trying to just get more information about it. Like in the olden
I need
times,
the phone number of the neighborhood coffee shop or something.
Exactly. Yeah. So like something very utilitarian, like a phone number or an address. Maybe even folks who like want to like read the description or like see the photos, or just like get a sense for the place. And so I think that might also feed some useful inspiration for the design of this in a bit. At this point, I also like to just at least quickly think about like what are these users doing in this particular context to solve this pain point. in the absence of this new feature from Google Maps.
Okay.
So the pain point here being potentially like, I want to know more information about this business because it's COVID, from an end user's point of view, or from a business's point of view, like I want to publish more information, uh, given that it's COVID and things are different in terms of how I run the company.
Yep.
So if we think about like potential competitors here, like maybe we can use Yelp as one
Yeah.
example to look at. They're similar in the sense that they kind of aggregate businesses, information about business together. They have like geographic search, things like that. Probably pretty competitive with us. They do focus a little bit more on restaurants. They do other industries as well, but they're a bit heavy on restaurants. So that might be kind of like one source of competitive inspiration. From a business's point of view, another competitor, so to speak, is their own website potentially. So like a lot of these companies will have their own like Squarespace site or Wix site where they can publish information to the internet. So that's maybe something to keep in mind that a lot of businesses might be turning to that as sort of the first thing.
Or even just like their Instagram feed, right?
Like exactly.
Like, especially for local businesses, that's popular these days.
Totally. And from the end user's point of view, like it's kind of interesting to maybe think that a competitor to any feature we build might be just like calling the business. Like, given it's unusual times, people are just like, the internet won't be updated, so they'll just like actually call the business. So some useful just like things to keep in mind as we sort of design it. Is it okay if I move on to thoughts about the MVP?
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. So for the MVP, where the goal is to design a feature to help local businesses in the time of COVID. And one assumption I'm going to make here is that we have, at Google Maps, we have some way to connect with businesses already. So like basically, I forget what the product is called, like Google My Business maybe, but there's already this product within Google where businesses can like claim their listing and like fill out certain templated information about it. I think that does actually exist, but we'll be a useful starting point.
Fair assumption, and I'm pretty sure it exists, and I have no idea what it's called.
Yeah, cool. So the MVP that I'm kind of mulling over is basically hooking into that system and adding a few new COVID specific or COVID special fields that businesses can provide, which get displayed kind of prominently in their Google Maps listing. So what does that mean in a little bit more detail? So in the time of COVID, there are probably going to be certain pieces of information that the local business wants to get out there. That if they can get it out there to a wide enough audience, they can, help their business stay afloat and not get hit as hard. So some examples here would be maybe they have updated hours of operation or like special or changing hours of operation over time. There are probably specific COVID safety measures that some of them might want to take. And this is where industry might become a little bit more relevant. So like restaurants, like in New York City, for example, definitely will want to broadcast whether they have outdoor dining. Whereas that might not be as relevant for other industries. Maybe they also want to broadcast like the number of people or like capacity of their store. Maybe they want to broadcast like any special offerings that they have. So like it could be a special menu for a restaurant, but even like, for like a pet store, like maybe they're offering something special to sell. Is an interesting question. Like for these fields, like, do you just want to do sort of like open free-form text entry, or maybe some of them can be made into structured multiple choice or like yes/no questions? A little bit of research there might be useful. I do kind of think like if you sat down and thought about each of the different fields you want to ask, you could probably make a reasonable first assumption about it. or like even better, maybe if you have easy access to some of these local businesses, just like ask them like,
Yeah.
what are
I'm
the
I'm curious,
things?
like, if you were at Google doing this and you were thinking about that specific problem of like, okay, what are maybe some of the common things that we would want to flag as fields? Like,
Mhm.
how would you think about trying to use any of the infrastructure you have at Google, either people or technology, to
Yeah,
do that? What would you think about?
yeah. If we have an easy way to get in touch with our existing like businesses who are on Google Maps on this
Mhm.
platform, great. Like maybe you could even shoot them a quick email and ask them this question,
Okay.
or like set up a quick call. Um, if that's if that has a lot of overhead, depending on when this is during the pandemic, you might be able to just like take some kind of a sampling of businesses, go to their websites, and see how they've updated their websites.
Okay.
Not all of them probably will have, but some of them might have, and you can kind
Yep.
of see, um, get data on like what they feel is important to put out there.
Got it. Okay. Cool.
Yeah, cool. Um, so yeah, so there's kind of this element of augmenting the form that small businesses can fill out on this small business platform. And then there's also the element of like showing this information on Google Maps
Yep.
on a particular listing. And so this is something you definitely want to engage with a designer on. This information should probably be prominent in the sense that you don't want to like have to scroll to the very bottom for this.
Yeah.
It should probably be like called out or highlighted in some way to specify that it is related to COVID and like COVID specific, like unusual in a sense. You probably don't want to put it above like you know you don't want to put it so high up that it's like above the name of the business or even above like those shortcut buttons to like directions or call or something like
Hmm.
maybe somewhere close to but below that and so yeah, like having like a new highlighted section there where the information is presented in kind of like a consistent ordering and in a consistent format depending on like what the type of data is.
Got it. And tell me a little bit about the sort of assumptions or logic you were using there as you were thinking about the information hierarchy. Like, why
Yeah,
shouldn't the COVID information be above, say, a phone number or website?
yeah, that's a great question. Something I would probably want to test and work with a designer on, but my thinking was that um, going back to like the different uh, reasons users are coming to Google Maps, like hypothetically, making up numbers, if we had data to show that like 70% of users coming to Google Maps are in the bucket of knowing where they want to go and just want directions, like that because that's like the majority of your users, you probably still want to make it easy to fulfill that flow. Whereas if you had data showing that, okay, that's only 20% of users, and actually, I don't know, like 80% of users want to browse, that's that's definitely way too high. But you would probably be more willing to prioritize this new code information above some of like the key common use cases.
Got it. Okay. That makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah, cool. Um, so I kind of touched a little bit upon what it looks like from the business side, a little bit what it looks like in Google Maps, so like what an end user would experience. There's also maybe an interesting element with Google Maps in particular around like their recommendation algorithm,
Mm,
because they're doing recommendations both like when you search, I think like autocomplete, as well as like they now like will show some venues in the map area by default.
yep.
So there must be some algorithm behind that. So kind of an interesting question to explore whether this COVID information should influence that,
Mm,
influence the ranking in the algorithm.
yep.
Not something you need for the MVP, strictly
Mhm.
speaking, but to the extent that the product overall cares about some of the metrics around those recommendations, like might be
Yep.
something to bring up with the team.
And talk me, I think that's an interesting point. Talk me through what you think some of the trade offs there between, say, influencing the algorithm that drives what shows up or the recommendations in what order with like whether or not that particular listing or business has COVID relevant info entered?
Yeah. So it's a good question, because maybe the strongest counter argument to the idea is that, um, like, in some sense, there's like a right answer to a recommendation, right? Like, do people engage with the recommendation? And whether or not people engage with the recommendation, you might think that that's agnostic of COVID information or like COVID preparation, right? Like, if um, like, I'm trying to come up with an example, like, if I'm looking at an area in like Midtown Manhattan and I want to look for an Italian restaurant,
Hmm.
like, the previous algorithm probably incorporated, some mix of ratings and like buzz of some kind and like how sure they are of the data about a restaurant to generate recommendations. And over time, that's honed by people like tapping on
Yep.
the actual restaurant. So if it's the case that people are still kind of like, I guess it's almost like what is the question they're trying to answer for the user with these recommendations? Like, if you're just looking broadly for like, what are some Italian restaurants of interest in this area, then you're right. Like, COVID information might not be as much a factor. But if the question they're trying to answer is, I want to go to an Italian restaurant, what is one in this area for me to go to?
Yeah.
The COVID information might be more relevant for an end user.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think you could certainly imagine from a user perspective, like in this era that we live in, unfortunately, like one of the most relevant questions is like, yeah, I know this is like a great spot, but like, are they open? Do they have outdoor dining? If they
Right.
do, how much they have? They used to be able to fit like 100 people, but now it might be like 20.
Yeah.
Depending on what their setup is. You can
Exactly.
see
Yeah.
how like that info becomes probably super relevant potentially.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that was an implicit assumption I was making that I should probably state explicitly, which is end users probably want and care about this data because it influences their decisions about where to go. So the whole reason, like, businesses want to broadcast it, great, but end users like want this information because like these are some of the top questions they want answered about a local business.
Yeah. You think there's like any other impact? Like, say you decide, hey, we are going to the recommendation algorithm will be influenced by the presence of some of this COVID information or not.
Hmm. Hmm.
You think there's any other benefit, or can you think of any other way that that may be useful, or even like, is there any ways that may be harmful that we're not thinking of?
Um, I mean, if you really wanted businesses to fill this information out, you could broadcast that you are using this as a factor, and that will probably give them a little extra carrot
Yeah,
to
a little
to fill it out.
incentive.
Yeah.
Yeah, yep,
Mhm.
I agree.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's probably the flip side as well, which is, is that a little Machiavellian is the wrong word, but in the chaos of just trying to survive as a local business owner, if you're
Mhm.
now like moving down the rankings because you haven't updated something in Google,
Yeah.
is that a trade-off that the Google Maps team feels comfortable with, or the right product decision?
Totally. Totally. Absolutely. Um, yeah. So those were some thoughts about the MVP, and I was starting to go a little
Cool.
maybe beyond MVP there. Uh, Maybe I can talk a little bit about like where this might go in the next iteration.
Yeah, I think that sounds good.
Cool. So for the like V2, loosely, there might be some other ideas that we kind of consider, and this should be influenced by like how the MVP goes and like feedback we get. But some ideas that uh, feel potentially more high impact to me right now in the absence of data. One might be to consider what happens if a business doesn't have an account with Google or doesn't have the bandwidth or desire to update its information.
Hmm.
Um, in this case, this would be kind of a large bolt-on feature, but maybe you could crowdsource and have some kind of an affordance for users of Google Maps to provide information, COVID-specific information about a
Mm,
business.
yeah.
I mean, you already have the ability to leave reviews, so
Hmm.
maybe this isn't too heavy of a lift, but this could be a way to help you patch up like just missing data if that's a concern.
Yep.
Um, uh, an interesting idea on the design side could be, do you want to influence how the little markers look on the map based on this information?
Interesting. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so like I think today, you have different little icons for like, restaurants versus like other kinds of establishments. Like I almost wonder if it would be interesting to modify the little icon, or like maybe use a different color, or like have a badge on an icon. I don't know, to signify when a restaurant has listed their COVID information. Partially, again, it kind of feeds into like, oh, this will encourage businesses to fill it out.
Yep.
Partially, I wonder if this helps users just like visually get a much faster sense of like what's on a map.
Yep.
I imagine, again, this is like maybe a consideration that Google Maps has thought about in the past, like how important are these icons and the thought behind them. But we have all the data at that point. So if it were important and we wanted to drive, some of those impacts, that feels like something we could do.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting idea, and also sort of brings up something that is related to what we were talking about earlier. That's sort of an in-between solution of like, does the information influence the recommendation algorithm or not? Like, it may not influence, say, the recommendation algorithm, but give some visual affordance. And related to that, you could probably do like, if a user cares, like let him or her filter by this place has inputted COVID specific info or not.
Yeah, totally, absolutely. Like a slight tangent, but when we were talking about competitors, like I think one thing Yelp does better than Google right now is the ability to filter. So I would bet that if Yelp started listing COVID information, like the next step they're thinking of is like, can you filter on the COVID information?
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. If we're thinking specifically on the business side, and this one I'm not as sure about because I'm not sure if this necessarily ties in with some of the goals, but there's a lot of potential like social good that Google could do on the business side. I use that term kind of loosely, but for example, when a business is looking at the form to fill out their COVID information, maybe they could include a link to the CDC guidelines for that industry, or the state's guidelines for that industry. It may even be interesting to show the local business, like, here are what other, businesses of your industry in your city are doing.
Like crowdsource best practices, sort of.
Exactly, yeah. And that, I hesitate a little bit, and I'll just bring in some of like the risk section here, because then it feels a little bit like you're starting to get into like, what are the guidelines for dealing with COVID? And I don't know to what extent Google wants to get into that.
Yeah.
But the data would all be there, so to speak, and adding a few links and charts is doable. So, yeah. So those are some potential ways the team might want to iterate on this feature after the MVP. Can I move on to metrics now?
Yeah, I think that sounds good.
Cool. So we said earlier that the overall business goal was engagement. So like engagement of users. There are probably ways already to measure whether or not a user engages with a particular business listing. So perhaps we can extend that to come up with a metric for whether a user is engaging with the COVID information on the business.
Okay.
So maybe like, I think what you want to know in essence is like, when a user has a business listing pulled up, are they looking at the COVID information?
Okay.
Maybe we have some way to measure that already. Or it could be like looking at user engagement with maps as a whole and seeing like, oh, okay, like users are engaging more with Google when they see businesses with the COVID section in the listing, or something like that. If you had like the visual markers on the map, like you could even see like, are users tapping on the ones with COVID info more than others?
Yeah.
And ultimately, like this would probably this could have an impact on like high level engagement metrics. So like, do people come back to Google day by day? Are people successful in like their searches on Google? Metrics like that. I think it also would be important to track the engagement of businesses with this, and that is almost a bit easier to track because you could just look at like literally how many businesses are filling this
Yeah.
out, either in pure numbers or like a percentage of business listings you have. You could maybe even look at like, are new businesses coming onto the platform because of this potentially. But like engagement on the business side, I think there are some numbers I would want to track there. What other thoughts did I have here? One, I don't know if this is creepy or not, but to the extent that Google Maps knows where users are, geolocation wise, like could they even tell if a user ends up going to a particular location that they looked up? That kind of gets more to like a task success kind of a metric.
Hmm.
But it would be very, very interesting to see that, like because a business lists this information, like their traffic is up like 10% relative to some baseline.
Yeah,
Or
that is
whatever.
interesting. Like, is this actually driving foot traffic for them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Um, I don't know to what extent we normally track like revenue coming from this, like advertising revenue. If that were something that were very important to the team or the product, we could try to like keep an eye on that as well, and
Yeah.
even influence that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Given sort of your initial idea of like, hey, we're going to focus on driving engagement with this feature,
Mhm.
thinking about the list of different sort of metrics and somewhere I think like areas of metrics you might focus on.
Mhm.
If you had to prioritize and pick, you know, I'm not concerned about the very specific number, but one or two of those, or maybe three at most, what are like a handful of metrics you would use to try and, okay, I can look at these metrics and get a quick read on whether this is working or not?
Yeah. I would prioritize a metric around like engagement of the user. So depending on what we can do, this might be like if we can do like time spent on looking at a business listing,
Okay.
um, that might be interesting, as well as like time spent looking at Google Maps as a whole, like browsing
Okay.
Google Maps as a whole. I think the third one I'd pick is probably so sorry. The first two are I'm kind of using like placeholders for like key engagement metric of end users with Google Maps. And the third one, I would probably say something around like task success again. So like the geolocation data, if we have it, a simpler version of task success might be like bounce rate or something like that, like trying to lower bounce rate. Because my hypothesis would be that higher success means more likelihood that users are getting value out of it and would use it again.
Got it. Okay. But you wouldn't actually prioritize anything about percentage of businesses that have actually inputted the information or, you put those particular flags on safety or special hours.
I mean, that's definitely my top five, but yeah, it's a good question. Definitely my top five. My sense a little bit is that it's not quite a two-sided marketplace per se, but you kind of need like both of these user groups to engage.
Hmm.
And if you had some small number of businesses doing this, I think you could start to get data on whether users are reacting. Um, and then later on, maybe if signs are very positive, you do keep an eye on the number of businesses who fill it out. Uh, but yeah, like if I had to pick between the two sides, I would almost want to focus on users because that feels like the thing we're trying to drive.
Got it. So the argument would sort of be, look, we're not going to see the user metrics move if no businesses are filling it out, because then there's just not going to be enough of this data for them to even react to. So you would expect that user engagement is neutral.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Fair.
I guess touching briefly on risks. I mean, one risk is that this is all pretty fast moving. Like there are lots of developments,
Yep.
so like there is always a chance that like in a month you realize that, oh, there's this new factor that's super important that hasn't been in your little new questionnaire yet, and you kind of
Mhm.
need to like keep iterating, so to speak. Um, Also, a possibility that in like 2 months, magically, the pandemic is over.
Yeah,
Um,
vaccines
yeah,
everywhere.
yeah. Um, I think there's a slight risk we mentioned around kind of just the topic we were mentioning around like, okay, what are the guidelines? Like, to what extent do you want to like push specific guidelines? Is that like, is the government going to get annoyed at us? So some kind of nebulous risk there, I think. Um, I think there it could be the case that different parts of the country just care about this overall or about specific factors to different degrees,
Yeah,
which makes, I think, the overall problem a bit harder to tackle, so to speak.
yeah,
In terms of like other help we need or other help we tap for this, like there's definitely going to be some component around ops, or maybe it's like the community team or the support team, like whoever's helping the businesses. Maybe that's a completely separate team within Google. But like, we need to get them on board, and then we need to kind of work with them to be able to support businesses as they use that part of the
yeah,
product. Um, Probably want to check in with legal for some of like the like guideline risks and things like that. Also, what if a restaurant lies?
yeah,
Some small risk there. And then I would definitely want a lot of help from marketing. Like this is not something to like create a billboard campaign out of from the very get-go, but like maybe they can think of some clever way to help us get word out there about the feature. Might be a little bit more impactful in the short term on like getting businesses to um, come and listen
yeah.
from.
Cool.
Yeah. And then the final thing I want to touch on was just like, where could this go in the future? So like
Yeah,
much longer term, what could this look like? Um, in the context of a pandemic, contact tracing, maybe. Maybe this is kind of like some kind of a gateway to getting Google more information that could make contact tracing a lot easier,
mm,
legally iffy, but there's that. But in terms of like the product, like supposing we think beyond the pandemic, maybe this is an interesting model to test out for any kind of like a special circumstance in the future. So it doesn't even need to be like a global special circumstance, but maybe like a store is having a massive sale in the middle of April for a very personal idiosyncratic reason.
yeah,
Like, could this be an interesting way for businesses to engage with Google Maps for these like more special like one-off events?
yeah,
Not to mention, of course, that you also have like more global events or like widespread events like Black Friday or like holidays or things like that. I imagine Google Maps has some way of dealing with holidays already, so maybe we can actually use some of those learnings here. But um, there might be something that feeds back in over
yeah,
there. Yeah, and so I think long term, I guess part of the potential hope of this is that you build the habit in your businesses that Google is the place they want to go when they want to like broadcast special information like this.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, those are kind of like two potentially longer term things.
yeah. That's cool. I like the longer term idea, particularly around what unique message does this business want to get out and potentially surface in Google. Like it's a little additional piece of real estate they own in the digital world.
Hmm.
And in a post-pandemic world, which hopefully we get to soon, knock on wood,
Hmm.
I could see that being very useful to very useful to businesses. And I could see it sort of flowing back into a bunch of things we talked about it. If you are, you were talking about users that just want to see what's around, like that type of user, like maybe you're visiting a new city and you just want to see what's around and like see which local shops are having sales. And if,
Hmm.
Google now has a way where folks can say, hey, we're having a sale on, you know, everything in the store, 50% off Tuesday through Saturday.
Hmm.
That would be kind of cool, actually.
Yeah.
And I think it's very aligned with certainly the small businesses, own use cases and interests.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Cool. Great. This is awesome.